Welcome back, everybody. Now that you've studied cellular respiration and you're experts on that, I wanted to talk about what happens when there is no oxygen in the environment and how organisms can live without oxygen. So, let's get started. Some organisms have the ability to survive even when no oxygen exists, and these are called anaerobes. They are anaerobic organisms. Some organisms have the ability to survive when anaerobic conditions occur. That is, they normally use oxygen, but every once in a while they find themselves in anaerobic conditions and they still survive. Finally, even within completely aerobic organisms like human beings, there are times when the cell becomes anaerobic. And so, how can ATP be produced in each of these situations? Well, let's find out. One method of extracting energy from organic molecules under anaerobic conditions is called alcohol fermentation and is shown in the next slide. You see that glycolysis occurs normally and ATP is produced, so glucose is turned into pyruvate. Normally, this pyruvate would be shuttled into the Krebs cycle, but if the oxygen stops being available, the electron transport chain shuts down, and that means NADH and FADH2 can't donate their electrons to the electron transport chain. And so the organism is faced with a dilemma. And so what they do instead is on each pyruvate, they clip off a carbon dioxide, just like what happened in the link reaction, turn it into acetaldehyde, and then they use the NADH to change acetaldehyde into ethanol, which is also known as drinkable alcohol. So let's think about that a little further. So organisms that use alcoholic fermentation use glycolysis to generate their ATP, and they also generate pyruvate. But next, they clip off the CO2 from the pyruvate to make this compound called acetaldehyde. And then they use NADH to turn the acetaldehyde into ethanol. Said another way, the production of ethanol regenerates the NAD+, which is necessary for glycolysis to happen. Without any NAD+, glucose could not go to pyruvate, and the whole reaction would shut down. The CO2 that is removed from pyruvate is why, for example, beer is carbonated. That CO2 carbonates the beer. The alcohol that accumulates is why beer is alcoholic. And yeast, which make alcoholic beverages, are an example of organisms that can survive in both aerobic and anaerobic conditions. So now let's look at what happens in a multicellular organism that becomes anaerobic. And this will happen, for example, when a muscle is used repetitively and at a high rate, such as during a sprint. How does ATP generation continue to occur in this case? In our body, in humans' body and other multicellular animals, we use lactic acid fermentation, which is similar to alcohol fermentation. This allows muscles to continue functioning due to the fact that ATP will continue to be produced. So let's see how that works. Here is glycolysis again, turning glucose into pyruvate. If NAD+ is not continually regenerated, it'll all get used up and will stay as NADH. Since that can't go to the electron transport chain, this glycolysis process will shut down. So the solution is to use NADH to generate lactic acid from pyruvate, and that regenerates the NAD+. And so now, even under anaerobic conditions, glycolysis can continue. So now we want to talk a little bit more about what happens during lactic acid fermentation. So why don't these organisms just use alcoholic fermentation? Why have this second process? And the answer is because ethanol is toxic to cells, and if it builds up to too high a concentration, it will kill the cells. And that answers the question why beer and wine have a low percentage of alcohol in them, because eventually the waste product from the yeast, the ethanol, kills the yeast, and no further fermentation can happen. So another question you might have is why can't aerobic organisms that have gone anaerobic use lactic acid fermentation indefinitely to power their muscles? In other words, why can't you sprint 1,000 yards or 2,000 yards? And the answer is, first, that lactic acid buildup in muscles is very painful. And the second is, glycolysis doesn't produce very much ATP. So it's very hard to keep the body running under anaerobic conditions. You can do it for a short period of time, but then you have to go back to being aerobic. It's important to remember that there is plenty of energy still stored in the lactate, just like there is in the pyruvate. So when aerobic conditions return, the body just doesn't throw the lactate out, it converts it back to acetyl-CoA through the link reaction, and it is fed into the Krebs cycle. So all that pain you feel when you sprint will be used to power your next generation of ATP. That's it for today. I hope you understand how organisms can be anaerobic, how some organisms can survive under anaerobic conditions, not all, and how almost all organisms can tolerate a short spell of having some of their cells being anaerobic. Until next time, go outside, look at nature, ask biological questions, bring them back to class, and I'll see you soon.